sacrament of reconciliation, that while you're not asking all Americans to come for communion or all Americans to go to confession, but by a parallel, you do want people to realize you are a sinner and you can be forgiven, and we can live together again as sisters and brothers, and we can be invited to eat at the same table. That those are all possibilities that are rooted, I think, in Jewish and Christian biblical tradition.
What if you turn hardship into grace, anger into serenity? Everything changes. Make your life a masterpiece. Welcome, I'm Yanik, your host, and now joining me, Françis X. Clooney. Françis X. Clooney is Parkman Professor of Divinity at Harvard University and joins me again here today to really discuss a controversy that happened in the US in terms of the nativity controversy and ICE, and we really want to try to unpack what this means and how does perspective help interpret this nativity controversy faithfully. I'm so glad to have you back, Frank, to the show.
Thank you, Yanik. I'm happy to be back, happy to support your good effort having this show. It's a wonderful thing, and so I'm happy to be here with you this hour, so great.
How does perspective help interpret this nativity controversy faithfully that happened in Massachusetts, where a priest decided to take away Maria, Jesus, and put a board up saying ICE was here?
Yeah. I mean, it is, in some sense, a matter of perspective, understanding, the symbolism, any symbolism, can be used in a way that's comforting and reassuring, and sometimes it can be used abruptly in ways that shock people. My guess would be that in some of the original accounts, let's say in the Gospel in Matthew or in Luke, the idea that the Savior to come, or the Messiah, would be born in a stable, would be put in a manger, would be a nobody, Joseph a nobody, Mary a nobody, the baby, just a baby, that this would have been perhaps shocking for people who thought that the Messiah would come on clouds of glory and triumphantly march into Jerusalem and defeat the enemy and take over. So it may have been some element of that in the time period in which these gospel stories were written down, that there was a shock value. You can see this even in the accounts we have where John the Baptist, came out of the desert. And John the Baptist comes saying, the kingdom of God is here. The kingdom of God has come. I come to you to baptize you with water, but the one coming after me will baptize you with fire and spirit. And everything will be changed. The wheat will be harvested, the chaff, the weeds will be thrown into the fire, perhaps expecting some kind of dramatic, decisive confrontation between good and evil. And then Jesus not doing that. Jesus certainly was, forthright and could challenge people even abruptly. But it seems that perhaps the powerful message that John was hoping for, Jesus was not strong enough or strident enough to speak up as perhaps John expected. So I suspect the many of these symbols we use have like multiple angles to them. And as you say, it's a matter of perspective on which ones are helpful in the times in which we happen to live.
Can sacred symbols hold protest without losing holiness?
Well, you would think that, symbols that are holy will survive, first of all. They're not going to disappear. There can be such a thing as blasphemy or sacrilege, which can be an insult to what is holy. But if you think, in human history, some of the great symbols have in fact been used in different ways. An example that comes to mind is the bread and wine we use at Mass, the Catholic Mass. These were symbols for the Jewish people that the Exodus was beginning. They were leaving Egypt. They were rejecting the power of Pharaoh and his enslavement of the people, and were trusting Moses to take them somewhere else. And the idea that they were in a rush, they only had the unleavened bread to bring with them. This was not simply, according to a ritual book, use unleavened bread, but this was a necessity for people who were in trouble. The state was attacking them. The Pharaoh wanted to kill many of them, and they survived on this bread. They were in the desert. So these are tough times. And I think some of these symbols were holy because they were disruptive. And so even the crossing of the Red Sea, as we hear in the book of Exodus, if you think of it, on one hand, it's a very comforting symbol, God leading the people out of slavery, but then the waters close down and kill so many Egyptians. That could be discomforting to Egyptians and also to people who expect to live in peace and harmony, that the waters closed and drowned many of those who were going to kill the people of Israel. So things like that, I think, can cut both ways. Jesus, St. Paul, even before the Gospels, talks about the sign of contradiction, that there can be something about the preaching of the gospel that is an insult to the way we normally do things, a discomfort, a challenge. Jesus says, as you know, elsewhere in the gospel, I have come not to make peace, but to cause division, father against son, mother against daughter. I have come to bring fire to the earth. And this, again, Jesus has a mixed presentation, sometimes very peaceful, sometimes seeming to say, I will break families up and set them against one another. So I think there's a certain, realm of relevance around the holy that if we see it simply as a sacred space that should be kept away from everyday life, we may be selling it short. We have to respect it. Normally, we do not abuse the sacred by using it for political reasons. But nonetheless, there can be a sense in which if we're too comfortable with the sacred, and it's like saying we're too comfortable with God, luckily God is exactly what I want God to be. And God is always affirming me. That could be an illusion. And therefore, some kind of breaking through and changing things might also be part of the holy.
That is really brilliant, and you really make me think and see those kind of things in a very different manner, because I think it's very helpful, because when there is change, when there is some disruption, then it's much more likely that we reflect more deeply about our lives and what we ought potentially to change in order for the betterment of society as a whole. Where is common ground between compassion and church norms?
Well, I mean, I'd like to think that church norms in general are on the side of compassion. That, the basic commandment, love God and love your neighbor, that these are, in a way, saying that compassion, mercy, are part of the Christian message. Now, the norms, if compassion comes across as saying, I can do what I want because in the situation I'm in, I'm not satisfied with the norms, that could end up with kind of a freelancing, a sense where I decide what the church should be, what the church's message should be. And in an organization as large as the Roman Catholic Church, of course, none of us, including me as a priest, is a person who simply has the right to define what the church says or does. It's an elaborate hierarchy. There's, decision-making levels. And so there are many complications about who speaks for the church. And I think we've learned in the past years, 60 years since Vatican II and a long time before that, that on the one hand, too much concentration of power in the hand of let's say, the Pope. The Pope speaks for the church, period. That can be unhealthy because there are many, many voices. There are bishops, there are priests, there are religious. The people of God all have things to say. But if it comes down to a kind of an entirely democratic principle where everybody has equal say, then you don't have an organization anymore. You have chaos. And then the practicality of the situation we're pointing to, if there is a concern in the country about illegal immigration on the one hand, and then about the mistreatment that many perceive of immigrants, illegal immigrants, then where does the compassion come in? And toward whom is one being compassionate? And I think some of these issues are often in the church's history left to lay people, that the priests and the bishops and so on are not the experts on society in general, politics in general, economics in general, and it's often lay action, lay responsibility to implement the teachings of the church in society by things like people running for office, local organizations, people voting in elections, where it doesn't work in our day and time for simply the let's say a diocese to issue a statement saying here's the way you should vote in the election, but that there's a certain necessary respect for people to do what they think is best in terms of voting for political office, one party or another, making compromises and so on. But in this case, I mean, I think Father Josima in St. Susanna's Church, I mean, I think he could have looked and said, well, look, the bishops recently voted, to decry and to kind of lament some of the government's practices regarding immigration. We as Christians have an obligation to care for the outsider, the oppressed, the homeless, the marginalized, and to go beyond certain bounds in terms of how people are treated. The bishops very heavily, as you know, was almost unanimous. It wasn't unanimous, but almost unanimous in saying Pope Francis was right, Pope Leo was right. We have an obligation to the poor and the excluded, and that seemed to be the direction of the church's implementation of compassion. I don't know if you agree with that, though.
Absolutely, that really makes sense. Now, what role should the church precisely play in this controversy? Because it is very controversial, and when it comes to a diocese, for example, there are many different people, right, who have very different views on those kind of issues. And by and large, when it comes to those issues, we don't necessarily disagree on the problems. For example, illegal immigration, you can't just let it happen, because what you ultimately have is you don't have really the rule of law anymore. And that implies that that's the beginning of the end, And so, therefore, my question is, what is your take on the diocese and also the diversity that is within a diocese, and also the conflict that it can actually cause within if those kind of actions are taken?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. It's a very important question. I mean, I think several things I'd point out, and then I'll try to answer it. One would be the principle of subsidiarity, that namely over-centralization and everything should be decided from the center or from above is not an ideal in any human society. But subsidiarity, meaning when things can be resolved at the local level, that is actually better, because the local people are in the local scene and they understand the local situation. And therefore, in the Catholic Church, you have a diocese, you have the bishop, you have the chancery, you have the central authority. But in, let's say, a place like Boston with, I think, approximately some 300 parishes, they're different. And if you go to different parishes on Sunday in any diocese, you'll notice that the priest may be different, the architecture of the church is different, the makeup of the congregation is different. The previous pastor, 2 pastors ago, 5 pastors ago, people are different. And therefore, what works in one parish in terms of implementing, the values of the church, the values of the gospel, may not fit well with what's done in another parish. And I think, to put it more bluntly, some parishes are more conservative than others. Some are more liberal. Certainly some priests, and I gather Father Josema is one of the more liberal priests. I don't know him personally, but that there are, pastors in some parishes that would always hold back and be reticent about any kind of public action, and others who see that the gospel requires us to be active and to be prophetic. Also, I'd say there are levels of, sacredness. So it would be inappropriate, let's say, if the priest, in order to protest, let's say, world hunger, would, instead of using the unleavened host for the consecration, would use some kind of substitute, like a piece of pastry or a stale crust of bread to remind us of the poverty of the poor. No, that's, getting to the center of the faith and the respect for the sacred consecration that takes place at the altar, not to be fooling around with that, or instead of using wine, using some other beverage to make a point about protest. That's very central, and therefore I think it would be almost unheard of for a priest to feel that they could change that. Likewise, I think from the pulpit, preaching. Now, it's a tricky thing with preaching because preaching often should be prophetic because the readings are prophetic. The readings are challenging us, and therefore to preach faithfully could require making the congregation feel a little bit uncomfortable. But I've always tried in my many years now of parish work and preaching to not be political in the pulpit, and basically to try to stick to the usually Sunday readings and speak from the readings. And sometimes I'll say to people, there are other complicated ramifications of what I'm saying, there are implications. I'd be happy to talk to you outside the church. So if you want to stop in at the door of the church afterwards and talk about this or that, I'd be happy to. But I feel it's really decent and maybe necessary to not be in the pulpit and preach a Republican view or a Democratic view, if those are sheerly political views, or to get up and say, now in the coming election, you should vote for so-and-so, because it seems inappropriate to the preaching of the Word of God. You can talk about, the gospel calls for honesty, the gospel calls for selflessness, for service of the people, for care of people in trouble, but then don't push it in people's face by saying, therefore vote for so-and-so, or therefore vote against that law or something like that. So those are, at the altar, in the pulpit, if a priest, let's say, or a parish said, we're going to change the readings, and we're going to start having, readings from outside the Bible as the Word of God. And it could be, something from Ayn Rand, the very conservative free thinker, or we're going to have something from Karl Marx. I'm giving somewhat absurd examples, but that would be inappropriate because we're in church in order to hear the Word of God, not my substitute or somebody's substitute for the Word. But when you come to something like a Christmas crib, first of all, it's not required that any parish have a Christmas crib. It's not obligatory. A parish could, for some reason, say this year we're not going to have it. I believe this happened. I'd have to check the facts, but I think in Gaza 2 years ago, when it was particularly violent, the situation, there was no lighting of a Christmas tree. There was no outside crib, because this is not the time for this, and we're in a dangerous situation. But if one parish says we're going to have lots of lights in front of the church and the tree will be illuminated, and we'll have a life-size creche, Mary, Joseph, the baby with shepherds and angels, that's can be done. But if another parish says, for various reasons, we're not doing that this year, and if people agree, if people feel oppressed, like the pastor just whimsically makes up, his own mind, that's not good. But since a parish doesn't have to have a crib at all, I think there's some leeway there about what the crib should look like. On a less controversial point, hopefully, The figures in cribs that I know of in the United States are often white faces, as if Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were Irish or British. And if a pastor and people in the parish say, we want to be more authentic, we want the figures at the crib to look like they were Palestinians, to look like they're, Jews of the early centuries, so dark-skinned, different kind of hair and so on like that, that could be quite wonderful, even if in some parishes say, but that's not the Jesus, Mary, Joseph I grew up with. And therefore I'm disturbed that they don't look like the crib we had when I was a child. That seems to be a lot of leeway where a parish can make a decision. Now, what happened in St. Susanna's would seem to be, again, a choice that would, absolutely not work in many parishes. This was not, the will of the pastor or the will of the people. This was not even discussed. But that if it's St. Susanna's, and again, I've never been to the church, I don't know the priest, if they, as the leadership, let's say the parish council, thought this was a good thing to do, it could be done, even if the next parish or the parish across the river said, we'd never do that. Now, I think as far as I know from the newspaper, there hasn't been much. I was looking to see what the latest was about St. Susanna's, and maybe you have more info than I do, but that the diocese said they preferred that this not be done this way. And the pastor said he was going to talk to the bishop about this. And I don't know what happened after that. So I may be just behind on the times. But that I can see in principle that what is done in one parish is not done in another parish, and that it's not good really if a bishop thought everything to be done in every parish will be according to what I think should be done, but allow local diversity, just as what's done at a parish in Boston and a parish, let's say in Phoenix, Arizona, a parish in Miami, a parish in Indiana, a parish in Central Africa, a parish in North India might be different without Rome saying exactly what you should do in every parish everywhere in the world. I think it'd be too much to expect central authorities to say everything about everything on the local level.
How might Jesus' refugee story inform, not polarize, dialogue?
You mean Jesus as a refugee? That story of the...
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think, again, as I said earlier, it might have been, it's so familiar to us, it's not very disturbing. But to hear for the first time, the gospel story, there was no room for them at the inn. And so, like very poor people, they stayed out in a stable. The baby was put in a manger where the animals ate from. This itself could be disturbing. We hear about, the persecution of Herod wanting to kill the child, the flight. They flee in the night in order to go off to what is called Egypt. Whether they actually went to current day Egypt is not clear from the commentaries and so on, but they certainly went off far away to be far away from Herod's power. That could be seen, let's say you can imagine people reading the gospel or hearing, the unwritten versions of what Matthew says or Luke says and say, wait a minute, you're being unfair. You're being unfair to Herod. And you're also kind of being anti-authority when you should respect what the priests were saying, and the priest and the King Herod were getting along with each other. So aren't you being unfair by portraying Jesus as a victim who had to flee? And therefore people could get into like journalism. Well, the story that Herod was going to kill all the children and so on like that. Oh, that's just propaganda. That's not true. But if we take, what the gospel says, then, again, they're not at home. They're not in Nazareth. They're in Bethlehem. They don't have a place to stay. They're living in the stable. They have to flee, probably with hardly any possessions, across the desert. Imagine, spending nights out under blankets, in the middle of nowhere, maybe hungry, and that this begs for, comparison. That, for most of us, including me, I'm in a house that's warm. I know that there's food when I want it. I'm not a refugee. I'm not a migrant. I'm not fleeing from anyone. at the moment. Whereas to say, well, who is it in our society is homeless, who's fleeing, who's afraid to go back home because they may be persecuted or even killed. Well, Jesus is like, let's say, people who leave their home country because of persecution or because there are gangs who are threatening to kill the family. There's sort of an analogy there saying that's what the Holy Family was like. It was a Holy Family in very dangerous situations. And that if you've never been, as I've never been threatened directly by even a policeman, I've never been, dragged into court or even thrown in jail, anything like that. When I see a police car go by, I don't run for cover because I've never been threatened. But other people have had very bad experiences, both, let's say, in their home country and perhaps with police or law enforcement here. And they see this is a symbol of power that might be for me or might be against me. And they could say, well, that was true for Jesus too, that that there were people who were for him, people against him. When he was a baby, there were people apparently who wanted to kill him. And if we take the gospel account literally, Herod did have all the children in Bethlehem killed, boys under 2 years old. All kinds of elements of analogy that it seems like Jesus is like a migrant, is like the outsider, like the illegal. They didn't have quite the same standards for illegal immigration then, I presume, but that if they cross into a foreign country and sort of are just refugees, they're there, without being invited, without permission of the government, and so on. You can push it too far and say, well, you're making it too literal. But the idea of fleeing and being in danger, I think, does evoke some kind of cultural, political analogies.
How do you see the demonizing of ICE in this specific case?
Yeah, that's a very good question because, and again, I've had very limited contact with ICE, even parishioners. There's one parishioner in my parish, I believe, who works for ICE, but we've had very limited conversations about what ICE is doing and so on like that. I think, demonizing ICE and saying these are, wicked people out to destroy families and drag children away from their parents and lock up old people, that's unfair because many of these people, I think, are trying to do the right thing. They have jobs with obligations. They're not necessarily cruel. They may be respectful for people's rights and dignity. I think it can be unfair in the media, and again, I'm not expert on this, if the newspaper headlines are only the worst cases. And so look what ICE did in such and such a city when they broke into the car and they dragged the people out, or look what happened when they took away the child from the parents. Those are worst case scenarios. Just as somebody, in political power might say, well, all the illegal immigrants are rapists and murderers and they're threats to our society. There may be 1 in 1,000 who in fact is criminal. But to say all immigrants are dangerous and threats is really not better than saying all ICE people are evil and should be resented and pushed back against and even threatened. That kind of threatening and demonizing is inappropriate. And you could see in the Gospels again that Jesus could deal with, temple officials. He could deal with Roman soldiers. He could deal with tax collectors without demonizing these people. He seemed to have greatest trouble with people who were absolutely self-righteous and thought, everything I do is directly from God. And that could be to the right or to the left. Everything I believe is actually God's word is unlikely. And that's true whether I'm a conservative or a liberal. But I think, your point about treating even the people who work for ICE as human beings and respecting them and not generalizing is very important.
Yeah, and I think it's so important because everyone who works in the police force or for whatever, in security is ultimately a hero, at least in my case, because as you also said, right, I always had great experiences with them, right? And also I acknowledge that why I'm feeling so safe in the countries I live is precisely because I feel like I can truly trust on them. But that's
Yeah.
my personal experience. But I think it's a tremendous job that everyone does when it comes to law enforcement. I mean, the job is such a tough job because you are constantly confronted with the bad things that usually happen in society, right? You don't go and go into a house if something is beautifully happening, right? And so therefore, really, to anyone who is
Yeah. Yeah.
working.
So it's easy, for me and maybe for you to be critical of what law enforcement does and what is done when there's a crime taking place or when there's a phone call about something bad going on. But to be there and risking one's life makes it hard, even for very good people who are just trying to be peacemakers. Um, there are dangerous people in the world, and there are people who have weapons and have malign intent and want to kill people, as we see in the headlines all the time. And nobody's expecting me to pull out a gun and shoot the perpetrators or defend innocent people with force. Nobody expects that from me. So people in that situation, to put ourselves in their shoes and say, well, what would you do if you were there? Now that doesn't mean a carte blanche. It doesn't mean therefore anything that a police officer does is okay. And we can all think of cases where either the tragic mistake was made and the wrong people were either apprehended or sometimes killed, or that somebody seemed to totally abuse their power by almost beating somebody to death or suffocating them or something. To say no, even though you're a police officer, there's no justification for that. There was no danger to you. There was no danger from the person. Why did you do that? I think we have to be able to be critical. But on the whole, again, it's easy again for me to say a presupposition that people in jobs like law enforcement are basically trying to do the right thing. And yet then to point out when they're doing the wrong thing, and this would be true for priests too. I mean, I think demonizing the clergy is not a great thing. I mean, it's a trivialization of what priests give their lives to, what religious leaders give their lives to, and therefore being grateful, even if the priest is too liberal for my taste or too conservative for your taste, whatever, to be grateful for the way they're giving their lives to these good works. But that doesn't mean, oh, Father, anything you do, I trust it, because I think we've learned that that's not appropriate. We have to be able to point out, you're a wonderful person, you're a good priest, and I really think did something inappropriate there or there or there. And the same with the bishop. You didn't do the right thing. Somebody has to tell you that this was wrong. And it doesn't mean overthrow the government. It doesn't mean I'm now the bishop or I'm now, infallible. But everybody who has any kind of power has to be able to be challenged. But the presupposition, I think we agree, should not be that, until proven innocent, people are guilty or that people are ill intentioned. No, give people the benefit of the doubt whenever possible.
That is so important, and that's precisely the point, right? The polarization that we are facing as a society. And as you also say, right? I mean, when I look at what the church has done over the past 2000 years, it's absolutely stunning. I mean, we will not live in the society we are now living in without the church, without Christianity. I think that's also the miracle, and it has a dynamic, I think, also to some extent a self-defeating dynamic, right? Because as in the gospel says, right, the first will be the last, and the last will be at the first. So there is something very particular also in the gospel, and therefore there's always the hope, but also the contrary, right? And so, how do you see the world, especially now in the context of the United States of America, the role that polarization plays, and the specific role that the church and also the clergy can play in order to reinstate trust?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and this gets into, cultural analysis and social analysis that's not my competence. I mean, I read the newspapers every day. I look at, certain programs online. I know, what people are writing in op-ed columns and so on like that. And a general consensus, apparently in so many of the polls and all that, the country is going in the wrong direction. And that, in Congress and so on, there's a breakdown of civility, a breakdown of ability to work together, that not only, as people point out in politics, not only do you disagree with me on this issue, but you're my enemy, and that you are actually evil because you're in the other party. And that seems to be, is not the case in the past, and that there seemed to be a stronger sense of we're in this together, we have to work together. And then also, I think it, divisions in the church, and certainly the 2,000-year history of Christianity, there have been times when minority groups in the church have been persecuted, people have been burnt at the stake, people have been driven into exile, uh, Christian rulers have fought wars against each other on doctrinal issues and so on. So there are all kinds of things like that that can happen. Um, but in some sense, you would hope, blessed are the peacemakers, that the church would be one of the peacemakers in society, reminding us of basic human dignity. We're all the children of God. We're all in this together. Love your enemies. All of these things should come to the fore. And I would add that, it's 60 years since Vatican II and the great document from the end of the Council, Nostra Aetate, about in our times having respect for other faith traditions, that it's also, I think, very Catholic to be able to say we want to work for peace and respect in society, but we're also willing to work with the local rabbi, the local imam, the swamis at the Hindu temple, the Buddhist monks, and other groups, that this is not a competition saying only we can do this and we can do it on our own. But if the church, which has such a dominant, still, influential role in American society, can take the lead, and some of these other groups are so small, percentage wise, to create the forum in which, civility can come back, that's so important. I think, we see, think of what's going on now with Pope Leo, our new pope, who seems to be, still very early in his papacy, but kind of living out a sense of moderation and prudence and um, quietude, that he's following, as he should, in the footsteps of previous popes. Let's say both John Paul, Paul VI, and certainly Francis. That he's not radically changing things, but he also seems to be desiring not to be disruptive and not to be bringing division into the church. And so trying to, pick bishops who are pastoral, bishops who care about, as good shepherds, caring for their flock, not bishops who are known for their radical positions to the right or the left. And I think then you hope that bishops on the local level, and then priests in the parishes and other leaders in parishes, would also say our job is basically the good of the people in the parish, in the diocese, in the church. And then, when the bishops meet in this country, you'd hope that they realize, intra-Catholic battles about this issue or that issue are important, but it's actually less important than our obligation to help America be a better, more just, more peaceful country, a good country. So it's a tricky thing working it out on different levels, but the church has the potential and therefore the obligation to be peacemakers and show the love of God in practice.
How do you personally deal with divisions within your community?
You mean in the parish or the school or the
Both.
Jesuit camps? Yeah. I mean, I think often enough, the issues debated, let's say at Harvard University or in the Divinity School where I teach, are understood to be there's basically a large middle ground here, and that some of us are more radical to the right or to the left, but that most people, professors who've been around a long time, saying, okay, that's always been the case. They're always right, left, center. There are radicals, there are moderates, there are conservatives. But we're doing this together because we're running a school. Students often, being much younger than professors, are necessarily, and thank God they are, being more radical, and denouncing what they see to be evils, denouncing violence, denouncing bias, demanding justice, both on campus and off campus. And it can seem to students, I think, sometimes that professors are like just too old or too passive and not being radical enough. Um, and I think it's a matter of creating situations, and I think this is done in good faith at places like Harvard Divinity School and Boston College and Notre Dame and other such places, of creating a climate where people can talk to one another about their disagreements. And so when it comes to a policy of the school, there may be disagreements, but it should be possible for people to disagree without becoming enemies or going to the media or going on Facebook and denouncing one another and so on. So that's on campus. I think, again, as I said earlier, in the parish, I think parishes have different identities and different kind of cultures, you might say. And I've been going to the same parish close to 30 years now. And I think, I'm part of the parish. The people know me. I know them, even though every year there are new people and elderly people pass away and so on. That's sort of a place where, over the years I've learned to fit. I fit there. Um, Whereas if I abruptly was taken out of that parish and sent to another parish, um, it might not work out very well at all. Like, you're speaking almost like a foreign language to us. Like, what are you talking about, Father? Whereas in my parish, people have a long memory of me and I have a long memory of them. And even when new pastors come in, there's sort of a continuity so that we're not having big conflicts in the parish. And I give this credit, mainly to the pastors and the leaders, the men and women who lead the parish, of creating kind of an environment of trust and conversation. But I can't recall actually, except maybe in one or two cases which didn't last too long, really, heated disagreements in the parish about things. Um, and often, as a weekend priest coming in on the weekend, it was not my job to make the decision anyway. It was the pastor's decision. Um, so I think, yeah. And then some people will say, well, shouldn't you be aware more of conflict? We're in a country where there's so many divisive issues, moral issues about things like immigration, illegal immigration, about what ICE does, about gun violence in the country, about health care, about abortion, and other such issues. Shouldn't you be more involved in real arguments? And isn't it too easy for some of us, to simply let it go and say, okay, we're never going to resolve that, so we'll just leave it? And I know people, let's say working for the Catholic worker movement, who would say, not only should be vaguely concerned about gun violence or vaguely concerned about nuclear weapons or the treatment of migrants, you should stop doing the job you're doing and get out there and do something to help the people on the streets. So we don't want you to just like write a blog about this or give a nice sermon about it. We want you to get out in a situation of conflict and stand there and block the way and prevent people from being taken away or insist on bringing food to the hungry. Yeah, and I admire greatly. I usually don't act like Catholic workers do and don't do as they do, but they're very prophetic and they're kind of reminding, do I have any good reason for doing the things I do? And why is it that my life is not caught up in conflict all the time? Shouldn't our lives be more caught up in conflict? Um, Again, this is going back to what I said much earlier. On the one hand, it seemed like John the Baptist was more expecting more conflict. As he comes out of it, we heard this on Sunday a couple of weeks ago in Matthew's Gospel. He comes saying, yeah, prepare ye the way of the Lord, and then turns to the leaders of the people and says, you vipers, you snakes, you come here thinking you're justifying yourselves, but you're fake. And when the Lord comes, there'll be a fire and you'll all be burnt up in it. And that's John the Baptist, who's one of the great figures in the biblical history. And then Jesus comes and doesn't do that for the most part. And he preaches feeding the hungry, curing the blind, forgiving the sinner, sending people on their way. And I think maybe this is not that you say, do you follow John the Baptist or follow Jesus, but rather that the Jesus element is central, but that doesn't mean there can't be a John the Baptist figure in the church, and there can't be a St. Paul figure in the church, or a Peter principle in the church, or a Mary Magdalene in the church. There have to be different charisms, and some people, should be outspoken and prophetic, and other people should be compromisers and peacemakers, and so on. It's all over the place.
I think that's so important what you're saying, because your role is very clear and you have really clarity. That's what you stand for, and therefore you can reflect thoroughly about those problems. And because you don't get too involved emotionally, you still can really think clearly. And I think today what we have is, especially in universities as well, but as you mentioned, right, that's needed. You need this kind of diversity, the radicals, the conservatives, and this dialogue where we find somehow common ground, right? And therefore freedom of speech, all those kind of things are pivotal in order for us to really advance our society for a better place. And I think therefore, as a result, really the United States of America is really the greatest country in this sense, because it facilitates this. Of course, there's always a question of balance, right? Because now with social media and all those kind of stuff, it just magnifies all the negative stuff. It's just magnified, right? And it becomes really, really hard for at least the majority of people to really think clearly and look at different situation and at the situation from different angles in order to better understand it, rather than get caught up with just rage.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're getting to very basic issues that, again, are outside my expertise, but like, what does it mean to be an American? Let's say, take in this case, United States. What is it? What does the United States stand for? And this gets into controversies too about, um, ways of reading American history. God gave us this land. God gave us blessings of many sorts. We're so graced to be here. That's one story. And then another story, of course, is, well, people came from Europe and took the land away from the native peoples, and many of them died of disease. And then, there was slavery, and a war had to be fought to free the slaves. There are all these kind of dark sides to American history, too. But again, I think you're right that, again, it sounds like an old man speaking, going to the extreme can be the problem. That the only story of America that's truly patriotic is everything is fine. Everything has always been fine. Since Christopher Columbus got off the boat, everything has been fine. That's absurd. And go to the other extreme and say, this country is a disgusting mess and there's nothing good about this country. Well, that's absurd too. And some sense of, and this I think is a Christian and Catholic virtue. We're all sinners and yet forgiven. And that would apply to countries as well. And say, my country is sinless. We have done no wrong, is simply unchristian and also wildly unrealistic. But to say, and you've done this and you can never, ever be forgiven what you did, well, that's not Christian either. And so what do you do, in a person's life and said, well, 30 years ago, I committed this crime. I'm sorry, you can never be forgiven. Or you live your life and you can be forgiven. What do you do with a country that says, well, 150 years ago, we did this, which was terrible, or 300 years ago, we did that, which was terrible, or yesterday, we did that, which was terrible, and I can never forgive you, and you people are my enemy from now on. Well, that doesn't lead to healing or respect or forgiveness. There has to be some sense that, the values we have in the church of communion, gathering at the altar, sacrament of reconciliation, that while you're not asking all Americans to come for communion or all Americans to go to confession, but by a parallel, you do want people to realize you are a sinner and you can be forgiven, and we can live together again as sisters and brothers, and we can be invited to eat at the same table. that those are all possibilities that are rooted, I think, in Jewish and Christian biblical tradition.
And that's precisely why the gospel is the most and the biggest love story, really, that ever took place, in my view, when I read it and listen to you, because it's really forgiveness. And so, what is your take on? I just want to quickly touch on what you said, that usually, of course, there is always, and that's what's the beauty is in university, there are younger generations and older generations. And how I see it usually is that the older generations, they have experience and therefore they have wisdom. Okay. And of course, the radicals, they also have their place, right? Because they cause of some, or they lead to some disturbances, right? They make us rethink think. But overall, I still would say that wisdom is truly what really prevails overall.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a tricky thing because you don't want to say in a condescending fashion. I don't want to say in a condescending fashion, young people will get all bothered by these things, but when they get older, they'll calm down. Because there are young people who are absolutely committed to justice and to changing society, and they're still doing that when they're 60 or 70 or 80 years old. They said, not just because I'm older, it doesn't mean I don't believe in justice anymore. Um, However, I think life experience, forces us to remember good times, bad times, ups and downs. Like for me, at my age, people may be scandalized by this or that, figure in government today. But then I remember when Richard Nixon was president, um, and the impeachment, and he was pushed out of office. I remember when the Vietnam War was dividing Americans and, people protesting in the streets. Um, that you remember, over time, there have been many situations of extreme animosity among people fighting with each other, even occasionally, like at Kent State in 1970, I believe, the troops shooting into the crowd of students and killing 4 students. And other times, very radical groups bombing buildings and killing people. If you live long enough, you realize these things have been going on my whole life, and that some of these things have been going on since Adam and Eve. And think Adam and Eve, you have 2 children, 2 sons, Cain and Abel. So what do? Cain kills Abel. How's that for a start to the first family? Um, and that it shouldn't mean, violence always happens and things always go wrong. Therefore, don't bother. Just watch TV, um, have a good life, and just ignore the bad news. But to not a certain wisdom, I think you're pointing to, that the world is not becoming 100% better. We're not progressing to kind of a perfect society, and therefore should not hold each other to standards that nobody can live up to. And that, I think, is a tricky thing because on the one hand, there are things that are intolerable and things that need to be condemned. And you can, pick out examples from around the world about this, I suppose. Um, but on the other hand, you can't say, if you're not perfect, I condemn you completely. Because all through my life, we've never had a perfect president. We've never had perfect leaders. We've never had a perfect church. I've never been perfect even when I was young or now. Don't, allow perfection to be a club with which you beat other people. But also don't be lazy and say, now that I'm older, I don't really care anymore. It doesn't bother me. It's not going to happen to me. Let's just all have a good time when other people are in terrible pain. So it's always a balance, but that's some of it does come by experience. And sometimes when we get older, we need young people to remind us to wake up and start, thinking again about injustice in the world.
And this is so important, but I think it's also very important to remember that, especially when it comes to political matters, as you mentioned with Richard Nixon and now Donald Trump, which is a very controversial figure, there's so many complex issues that no matter what you do, there is always positive and negatives that will ultimately emerge. That's just how life is. And it's actually Alan Langer who also said that you can never ever really take a perfect decision. The only thing what you can do, you have to make your decision right. And whether this is from a left or a right perspective, ultimately you have to go and work through, and it takes time. It's always a process. And whether you have a Donald Trump or another president, ultimately it's the trajectory and the evolution that we have to go through in order to evolve as a society. And there are, as I said, positive and negatives, and that's really what it is. And you mentioned a very important point, is that we have a tendency of judging people on their very worst moments, and it's very dangerous if we think that we have to have or aim by all means for perfection, because there is no perfection. There is simply no perfection. There is only, to some extent, progress. And as you mentioned, there is Christianity that gives you a North Star of how to best live your life.
Yeah, and I think, religious people, spiritual people know that the illusion of necessary absolute progress is a myth. It's a bad myth. And therefore, to expect that everything is always getting better, it's not Christian, it's not Hindu, it's not Buddhist, it's not Muslim. I mean, no tradition believes that we're somehow free of error or free of sin. And therefore, we just have to, live in a world that's imperfect and look in the mirror and say, well, I too am imperfect. But I think we have to draw to a close. But back to where we started, so what to do at St. Susanna's Parish? In some sense, subsidiarity means that the local pastor, in consultation with his people, does what seems to be right there in that parish. And then the bishop and the chancery have to then decide, what do we do regarding what decision they made there? And I'd like to think that both, the parish is doing its best to make the right decision, and the bishop is doing his best to make a right decision. And sometimes those may end up saying, okay, you can do that, but I really would be unhappy if other parishes did that, and make that clear. Or sometimes a bishop can intervene and say, again, what you're doing is not simply ornamental, because again, certain things are less important in the church, and Christmas cribs are less important than the Eucharist, let's say. But you have to make decisions, and then which issues are important enough for me to be intolerant of what you're doing. So, and we could go on forever, but we don't have time now. But to talk about when you have to actually condemn and forbid and intervene, and when you have to say, I wouldn't do that, I wish you wouldn't do that, and I hope you hear me, but I'm not going to stop you from doing it.
Brilliant, Frank. Last question. What's your Christmas message to all the Americans, Canadians, and really the world?
Oh, that's what the Pope gets to do on Christmas Day, to give his message to the world, and the King of England gets to do it too, I think, a Christmas message. I would say, for let's say all of us, the billions of human beings, is in some sense to know the values that have been passed down to us by the generations, to know our family traditions, to know our religious traditions, to know our culture, and to realize that by remembering the basics and trying to live them in the 21st century, we'll actually be better off. And so some kind of a memory of a long history before us will enable us to live better in the present moment. Religiously, I think that makes sense, but I think culturally also, don't try to wipe everything away and start over, but rather work with what you have and try to make it better.
Frank, thank you so much for truly be a blessing to myself and really to the world.
Thank you, Yanik. Wonderful conversation. Happy to be with you today.
Frank X. Clooney. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.the-ykm.com. meant to